Troubling the Water. I had an opportunity to read this book. Here, I'll put it up like that. That way people can see it. I had an opportunity to read this book a little earlier, and one of the things that really struck me about it was just like your heart was clear in it. You didn't try to make yourself look especially good, or even totally drag yourself through the mud, but really invite people onto a journey with you of kind of your own evolution and growth. And so just grateful for that. But I am assuming that most folks in this room have not yet read the book. And so I'm going to ask a few questions that hopefully will give an opportunity for folks to kind of get a little bit more sense. But also, I have some questions. So no spoilers, okay. Well, I mean, it's pretty early in the book, and so you kind of start off by talking about these 4 quadrants. And so I was wondering if you could kind of describe what those are and how they function.
Yeah, so one of the frameworks that we offer in the book is really trying to help us think about how do we make sense for how complex our people dynamics are in our societies, the places we work, the places we worship, et cetera. And so we came up with a framework which is not a panacea, but hopefully it's a tool that invites us into reflection. And what we said is that in most human experiences, you can organize people into 4 quadrants. They're powerful, meaning they set the conditions for how things go. They're the privileged, so they may not set the conditions for how things go, but they benefit from the status quo. Then you have the persecuted, who sometimes have agency into shaping what will be, but usually for reasons that aren't always clear, they're restricted from shaping things. And then you have the prevented, who usually just by nature of who they are, their racial identity, their sexual identity, their religious identity, they are prevented from being able to participate with shaping how things go. And so in this quadrant, what we try to do is to help people recognize that nobody is one thing. And the difficulty we have in our relationships is that we usually reduce people to just one thing, your race, your sexual orientation, your religion, et cetera, but it's more complex. And so for me, for example, if we talk about race in this country, I'm going to be in the prevented group because of the story of enslaved Africans. But if you talk about gender, I'm going to move up into the privileged because I benefit from patriarchy by nature of the construct of male domination. But if you talk about the company that we started, I'm going to move into the powerful because we started it, we hired folks, et cetera. So the invitation is hopefully to help us figure out how do we have a tool that helps us evaluate what's happening so that we can access more empathy when we need to, but also access more courage when we need to, but just recognizing that our human interactions aren't as simple as, you're this and I'm that. That the conversation is much more complex.
Yeah, I think the thing that's really also helpful about that is that we get taught to think in these kind of binaries, right? And not only you're only this thing, but you can never not be that thing, right? But you kind of offer a little bit more of a gracious kind of traveling, I guess, that helps us also understand too. There is at least one place probably for most of us in our lives where we might sit in the place of the powerful, right? Even if in broader spaces that might not be true. And so I think that that's a helpful sort of ground setting for then beginning to think about, okay, if I'm not one thing and I can kind of have this broadened sort of aperture of self-understanding, then how do I engage in this work of bridging, right? Like where and when am I able to do that? And so you kind of talk a little bit about that. And so I'm wondering if you could sort of describe this idea of bridging work. But there is also something that you say that like bridging can become an act of violence. And so I think that's an important sort of thing to tease out as well. So can you describe a little bit about the bridging work and how you understand that, maybe how that shows up even in your work with Empower Initiative, right? But also how can it become an act of violence?
Yeah. So to me, bridging is only of value if it's in service to trying to create belonging, because people are coming from different places. So we're going to bridge if it is true that we're trying to move towards a shared destination or location, experience with each other. But so for bridging for me, though, doesn't mean agreement. It doesn't mean affirmation. It means acknowledgement of another perspective, lived experience, point of view. And so in the bridging work, what we're seeking to do is to acknowledge each other's different points of view, perspective, and find ways where they're possible for those perspectives and views to move together and come up with new solutions that actually enables both of us to show up as our full selves with the experiences that we've come from. But to me, like a real bridge, you can't build a bridge everywhere, which means you can't build a bridge with everyone. But I think that just because you can't build a bridge with everyone doesn't mean you can't build a bridge with some folks. And so I think, from my background, having been engaged in a lot of racial justice work, what I started getting the sense of was that the only thing we saw as power building was about identifying an enemy and building enough power with the people that I agreed with to dominate that other group. And usually it was in advancement of some really righteous stuff. I almost cursed. Some really righteous stuff, right? But then also I recognized in our movements, it was easy for us to identify the enemy outside of us, but then we started turning on each other. And so people's biases that they had, even within like a racial justice movement around the notion of class, religion, sexual orientation, we begin to other one another. And so part of my call in the movement was, we need to figure out how to bridge with each other, because just because we all exist on the political left doesn't mean that we all really know how to engage with each other. But to me, I would say the harm of bridging and where it becomes violent is you can't bridge with somebody who does not see your humanity. So I believe that in bridging, we have to have some agreements to test, is this a relationship that I can actually bridge with? Is it time? Am I ready? Are they ready? It's still going to be hard. I did it with the cops. I don't like police. I've done it with Pookie and Ray Ray, who are shooting people in the community. I don't like violence. But me on a personal level, I've had to figure out how to do that. And so I feel like, we can do it with a lot of people that sometimes we say we can't.
And you were able to do that bridging work because there was this shared place that you were all trying to travel to,
Correct.
right? And everyone agreed that that's where we're trying to get to.
Correct.
So we're going to kind of make this effort.
Yeah.
And in your work, in your book, and also in your work, you kind of talk about this work of collaborating, the anxiety of collaborating with police, and you do a pretty decent job of sort of describing. I mean, there's like anxiety on all sides, right? The complexities of the relationships around the table, even among sort of the cohort of ministers who were there, right? So it's like different economic spaces, different racial identities, all that, like even with relationships within relationships, right? And so there's a lot of dynamics there. You talk about, folks who maybe were participating in violence, who were there for any number of reasons, one of them being that they had to because their parole officer sort of required them to be there, right? And so how, like, as people are bringing their anxieties, their biases, their, baggage into these conversations, were there practices that you all engaged in to sort of manage that, or even name, like, okay, I'm speaking from this place, I know that it's probably short-sighted, like how were you able to have productive conversation around those tables?
Yeah, in order to architect the space for bridging, there was people that actually had to draw up that plans and design that.
Okay.
And so one of the things that, I talk about that has to happen before bridging is what we call building shared humanity, or designing space to be able to do the bridging work in. And so this is when we get the sense of figuring out what norms, what agreements, what destination, where are we actually trying to go? What problem are we trying to solve? Because it can't just be about this, like,
violence.
Yeah, or just, like I've done all the racial reconciliation stuff and let's hug it out in the park and all of that kind of stuff, and it doesn't work, but I think if we're really, from my view, but if we're really trying to advance the goal, we have to design those spaces, design conversations. So to me, to really get to that place, it takes a lot of like planning, deep listening, designing to figure out how we actually move there. The other thing I've learned is it takes a lot of time. So looking to do quick change to get to belonging is something that I've just not experienced in the different scenarios that I've been a part of seeing it happen. When it happened, really positive results came from it. But for example, the gun violence work we did in Oakland, the police trust building, we started that the architecting of that work in 2008, 2009. The actual table doesn't emerge until 2012, 2013.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So you're talking about 5 years of underground foundational work
Yeah.
in order to create the environment. Now, once we get the environment set, well, then we reduce homicides by 50% over 5 years. And we save hundreds and hundreds of lives. We go 4 out of 5 years without a police homicide after every 6 weeks for 20 years. That can happen, but there has to be people that are willing to do the underground work.
And was that primarily the work of the folks at Ceasefire, the organization that you were working with, or was it in partnership with folks with Oakland Police?
Yeah, it was a bridging work. So Ceasefire was never an organization. It was simply a strategy. And so when I was a part of it, I was actually leading city team. And I don't know there's a city, I think there's still a city team in San Francisco, I'm not sure. But I was leading city team Oakland at that time. And so it was ministers, it was community-based organizations, it was the cops, it was the mayor's office, it was the local city human services who were all collaborating on this effort. But we, the faith community, the ministers, we were the ones that brought it forward. And the organizers, Oakland community organizations at that time, now Faith in Action East Bay, I think our San Francisco counterpart is Faith in the Bay Area over here. But we were all collaborating around this work. But in order to do that, we literally were having to bridge with every group. So for example, I had to bridge with preachers who also were bridging with me. Then I had to go to the street outreach team who hated preachers.
Yeah.
And I had to sit with them and get told off. Then you had to go sit with the police who couldn't stand activists, and I couldn't stand them. You know what I mean?
So you feel really good
It's wonderful.
throughout the entire process.
Yeah.
I feel super hopeful, the work of hope, right?
Right.
And then even in the midst of that, right, so you're kind of, there's a lot of spiritual discipline that's happening in that. But you described this pretty powerful and painful experience of, well, then everyone gets to the table, right? And there's some trust built. And then some of these young men that are sitting at the table for any number of reasons confide in you some pretty terrible things that are happening that have had since become public. But you really had to confront some of your own bias in that. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah. I know you said no spoilers.
Right. Oh yeah. Well.
But I'll share this because it's more unpacked there. I mean, the young men were telling me that the police department was sexually trafficking young women in the community, and to my shame, I did not believe them.
It sounds so outrageous.
Yeah, it did to me. Now it doesn't.
Yeah.
But at the time it did, and really what was most concerning to me was the person I went to try to find out if this really happened was somebody that I identified with, who was a Christian minister and happened to be a police leader. And so the commonalities I had with him blinded me from being able to listen deeply to those that were most being marginalized around us. And I tell the story in the book because I'm tired of all the stories that get told that centers the person as this hero or she-ro or they-ro, and you just, you fly in with capes on and you have no problems. I'm like, nah, that's not how it happens from my view. And so I think what I had to learn in that was that even though I had found something to do that was working around like the bridging work, it still didn't disappear the fact that I still had so much more to go and still do to really try to be a part of a wide circle. And the other thing that just sobered me about it was if I'm not on that journey, people are really getting hurt. Like young women were getting hurt because I didn't listen.
Yeah. Yeah, there's real bodies on the line in that as well. But I think, what is powerful about this, and you kind of talk a little bit about the power of the sacred practice of public repentance. I think there's something really powerful to that because it gives us a bit of a blueprint on how to name the things that we're ashamed of, right? And kind of defang that shame a little bit. I'm curious about, because you talk about it, that as being so important to you, and I'm curious about like why you see it as being so important.
Well, I feel like if we're going to get to restorative justice, it only happens if people are willing to be honest. And if the performative nature of not keeping it, I mean, say it the way we say it in my hood, keeping it a buck, right? If you're not going to keep it a buck around where you've gotten it wrong, then we're never really going to get to restorative justice and restore relationships. So I feel like, we're so, jacked up in our society because it's not been safe to be honest.
Yeah.
And to say, like, I'm sorry, but I messed up. I got it wrong. I harmed some people. I want to figure out how to do the work of restorative work for the people that are harmed. But instead, we cover up, we pretend, and I think that just...
And everyone knows you're covering up and pretending.
Yeah,
Anyway.
and it just perpetuates the harm,
Right.
And so
Right.
I just feel like, the more that our communities continue to become more diverse, it's going to require people to be more honest instead of covering up more.
Right. Yeah, one of the things that we have worked to practice here at City Church, since I've brought some of the anti-racism work that I used to do in Chicago and the values, institutional values that I learned that helped to increase commitments to anti-racism and practices around that, is transparent communication and decision making that guards personal integrity. And one of the things about that is that if you're honest about your institutional history and it doesn't even really make you look good, it actually increases people's trust because they're like, okay, well, at least you'll make it a buck, right? That's the phrase you use, right? Like they can, especially those who might be used to being the ones who sort of get thrown under the bus, it increases a sense of, okay, I can hang with these people maybe. Like they're willing to sort of admit some things. One of the things that you also talk about in your book, and if you have questions that come up, feel free to sort of keep them in mind. We'll have some time for asking. But one of the things that you talk about, and I think a lot of folks who are probably in that more comfortable zone, right, the 401k zone, right, who want to understand, who want to be a part of, at least not doing harm or reducing harm, right? Is they get really good at thinking, like understanding a problem, right? Like, okay, it's like this big and this big around, and this is how it works and whatever, and they analyze and understand it to death. But it's hard to move from that place of thinking to being, right? I kind of think about it like moving from your head to your gut. And so, what are the ways that you invite folks? Because I know part of your work is like this isn't even just doing, right? It's like the inner transformation work, right? So what are some of the ways that you invite folks to begin to move from the head to the gut, or not move from thinking to being?
Yeah, I mean, there's a formation, kind of invitation that we offer in the book, which is what we call the 5 A's. And so one of them is, yes, growing awareness around the way that othering is happening around you, whether that's racialized othering, gender-based othering, et cetera. Become aware of it, but then don't stop there. Move from awareness to accountability. And that's one of the steps that I feel like we miss. How has my complicity and or participation in the status quo created harm? But then don't stop there. And that's what I feel like happens a lot too, is people get in their heads, and then if they do move to accountability, then it's like guilt and shame. And then every time you see somebody that's marginalized or something, you're like, oh, I'm just so sorry and everything. And I told one of my white homies before, I was like, dude, okay, you forgiven. You know what I mean? It's like,
but so what?
I don't need you to you don't gotta apologize to me every time you see me. Like, I saw this on the news, I'm so sorry. I'm like, bro, I've been black for 46 years. Like, I'm not, you can relax, right? But then after accountability, move to articulation. So learn how to talk about the othering that is happening or the marginalization the way that oppressed people would. And then move from talking about it to advocacy. So now you learn how to show up in ways where you're invited by others that experience othering to show up. Then you can move to activation. You start inviting more people onto the journey. So awareness, accountability, articulation, advocacy, and activation. My concern has been is we've had too many people with awareness, a little bit of accountability, and then they jump to activation. So I want to understand something, and then I want to get involved in terms of telling others what they need to do. You're not ready yet. You need to slow down and get some skin in the game. And like for me, as a cis straight black dude that grew up here in the city, unless I can talk about the impactedness for a trans relative here in the city in the way that they would talk about it, I'm not yet ready to move into activation. I should continue to be a learner. And I think people should embrace being learners instead of everybody trying to figure out how to jump out front and look super progressive when it's really not leading to the change we need.
Yeah, I think that piece about articulation on the terms that the person, the one on the press side would describe it is, that's a really important nuance in there. It's a little bit like when, in things like couples counseling or, any kind of like partner conversation, be like, repeat back to that person what you heard, right?
Yes.
To make sure you heard it the way that they said it or the way that they meant it before kind of jumping to that response. So I think that's an important nuance to lift up. But you also talk about how, kind of toward the end, you talk about like you had to choose collective accountability over individual responsibility, and I think this is what some folks, certainly at City Church, but I think in general, really struggle with in terms of having hard conversations with your nuclear family and your parents, even to learn more how to be honest about the way that you occupy the middle, and also. I think I think this tension that you put between personal responsibility and collective accountability is an interesting one. So if you could sort of talk about the difference between that, and then how that shaped the conversations that you had with folks who maybe were closest to you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think sometimes when we reduce everything to just a personal responsibility and what I'm doing, that can be comfortable and safe because it's something that you can control. But I think when we look at, I have to think about the ways that even the tribes, the groups that I've been a part of, how have we caused harm for other folks? And one of the things that we were telling like white folks during the George Floyd 2020 summer, which was the last time I had my full Hulk out, that was my Ben McBride full protest Hulk out, where I was like, rah, we're gonna, marching in the street, and we're gonna shut the freeways down and the whole 9 yards. But one of the lines that we were saying to some of our white relatives was, we started saying, go get your people. Because a part of what we were saying was so many people were like, well, I'm not involved in this. And we said, well, it's not about you.
Right.
How about you spend time in some of those difficult conversations with people you're proximate to and help do that work? And they're like, well, I don't want to do that work because my family's racist and so on and so forth. And I'm like, and a lot of my family is homophobic and sexist. That doesn't mean that I can't stop not having conversations and trying to help push people along, invite them into spaces that they may not be super comfortable in, then do the work of translating with them after. That's a part of the fact that I come from these people and I have a responsibility to help the people I belong to be better. I have to think about ministers, think about the Black church and how we've shown up in very positive ways. I feel like if it wasn't for the Black church, there wouldn't be no America, because the Black church has saved America from itself many times. And at the same time, the Black church did not create space for Bayard Rustin, who was one of the most brilliant folks that brought about the civil rights movement, but nobody knows his name because he was a Black gay man, and their homophobia couldn't create space for that. So I have to continue to do that work to challenge those conversations, and I'm in those spaces, and I'm a Black Pentecostal at that too, so that's not just Black church, that's Black church on steroids, you know what I mean? So in those spaces, sitting with people who are like, well, what about this theological point I believe, or what about this such and such, and doing the work because I recognize that my religious tribe has created a lot of harm. So it's not just about Ben trying to be a better Ben, but it's about Ben doing the work to help others come forward.
Well, I think this last piece that you said, like at the theological point, being somehow it's divorced from the actual person that it might impact, and there's a tension between this piece of like, I have all the right answers versus like, is it actually producing the kind of fruit that God is inviting me to create in the world?
Well, and what I've shared with some of them too is, can you hold the fact that you have a particular lens, right, that you're bringing to theology? So you may feel that you have the right answers, but you have the right answers according to your lens. But someone else is reading the scriptures with a different lens from a different station. And I've said in Black...
You mean a wrong lens and a wrong station.
Yeah, Well, I think the invitation I've been trying to have for folks is our world is so complex that, and my experiences have been sitting in so many different spaces that I haven't seen a lot of right lenses. I've seen a lot of reaching lenses. I think we're all reaching to try to have a good lens. But when I'm on the left, there's some stuff about our lens that sometimes gets real small. Like some of the justice, evangelical Christians, don't want their kids to go to school. We're in the same neighborhoods where black and brown poor kids that aren't Christians go to. And yet they got a great theological lens that's open and affirming until it comes down to school choice. So I'm like, is that good theology?
Yeah.
So I think what I'm hoping that we all can have some self-reflection.
Yeah. And honesty. I mean, that requires a lot of honesty.
None of us have no pure lens. We are relating to God and each other from our station. So maybe that gives us some humility and I'm trying the best that I can, and I can get in relationship with others who could be like, I want to invite you to be a little better. And I'm like, cool, thank you, help me.
Right, right. But it requires a lot of, often what I tell folks is we can admit the ways that we that we might be not not right, whatever that looks like. If there's any place in the world where maybe that can happen, maybe that's church, because we have access to this technology called grace, right, which enables us to sort of acknowledge and then try again, and to be the kind of community that doesn't hold it against each other when we messed up, and we're trying again to say there is another way. You can never go so far that you can't come back home, right, in God's family. You talk about this actually a little bit when you describe this encounter with someone who tells you to always leave the light on, and that was just a beautiful kind of notion. Can you kind of unpack what that means?
Yeah, a part of my journey included me being a part of the Ferguson uprising in 2014. And so I was on the front lines when all of that work was happening. Very interesting because the story that's told on the news is always very different from real life. Long story short, we had what kind of was our generation's version of the Selma call when Martin invited everybody to come to Selma in 1965. The young people said, can y'all get faith leaders to come from all around the country to Ferguson for a massive demonstration? So we all got together. Long story short, we marched down to the Ferguson police station. We all got our collars on, and we marched down there to tell the chief of police that we're here to take your confession. Now, I'm a Pentecostal. We don't even take confession, but we marched down to the police department. We said, we're here to take your confession for killing Michael Brown and y'all being complicit in this, et cetera. And it's pouring down raining, and we say, we're not leaving until you all confess. And long story short, they arrest us. They put us in jail. So this is a very interesting jail at that time because you got, me and my brother Mike, who's also into justice. You got Reverend Sekou, who's now up in Washington. But you got Jim Wallace. You got Lisa Sharon Harper. You got Dr. Cornel West. You got all of these people in jail, right? Then you got a few people who did some stuff wrong, who's eating a bologna sandwich, trying to figure out who are all of these people sitting here with collars on in jail. Long story short, as they're booking us and all of this, very dehumanizing process. I'd never been put in jail, so I was, sitting with this whole process. In any case, Dr. West, every time they're moving them from place to place, they took all the strings out of our shoes. They move you around by holding your body so you don't get to move your body. And Dr. West keeps saying, oh, thank you, good brother. Thank you, good brother. Oh, thank you, good sister. Thank you, good sister. And we're looking at Dr. West, and they're moving around. Oh, thank you, good brother. Thank you, good brother. And so at a certain point, Mike looks at Dr. West, and he's like, Doc, why you keep telling these people thank you? Look what they're doing to us. And he said, oh, good brother, good brother, good brother. Now if you've heard Dr. West talk, this is how he talks. Oh, good brother, good brother. He said, always leave the light on because you never know when they'll come home. And it hit me with a ton of bricks because what he was calling us to was a deep level of empathy for people who were actively participating in our subjugation. And it just something that stayed with me so much to the point that in a moment like that, what would it look like if we kept leaving the light on for people? Which doesn't mean I'm here to excuse what you're doing, but I keep in my heart some space that you will step into your better humanity just like hopefully somebody left some space for me to step into mine.
It's a little bit like the story you shared about your dad as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. We don't have slips of paper, but if there are any questions that folks have that they wanted to raise, I wanted to give a little space for that to show up. Yeah, Thomas?
First, thank you very much, Reverend. Wonderful to have you here. I had a question around this length of going slow and time. And let's think about the 5 years. I'm kind of setting up to going in there. I imagine by year 3 or 3.5. Well, one, did you ever get questions of, will this ever even work? And when that happens, when you've not yet seen anything, what do you turn to keep going?
So just to repeat for folks online, okay, there's a mic over here, but the question was about sort of the time that it takes for change to happen, and maybe people's impatience around that, but also even maybe your own impatience. Like how do you keep in it when it feels like things are not moving at a pace that you want them to move?
So I would use 2 C words around what's needed, which is community and champions. In a champion, I think when we're trying to engage in the work, we need to be connected to others who have done this work before that we're trying to do, that can champion it and keep us with some inspiration. So when we were doing the work around violence in the bridging work, we were following the example of some of my mentors, Reverend Jeff Brown, Eugene Rivers, people who had done this work in Boston 20 years ago. It had been talked about, but then it disappeared, slipped away, as I talked about. But having access to them kept us inspired, kept us motivated, right? Then the other thing was community. So I found that you don't need everybody, but you got to have somebodies that you're in community with, that you all are helping to motivate each other and we know why we're doing this. So our motivation was like black and brown bodies of young men are washing the streets of Oakland in that story, right? So we had to keep their mothers in our mind. We had to keep them in mind and then say, we're tired, but they're dead. We're sad, the mothers are devastated. So let's be in community with each other and hold each other up in the moments that are hard. Did I want to give up through the process, whether it's the police violence work, whether it's gun violence work, whether it's doing bridging work with white evangelicals? Yes, all the time. Did I give up multiple times? Yes, and then come back to the table. Sometimes 6 months later, and then there were some tables I never came back to because a part of what I had to learn in my journey was about recognizing that taking care of myself was as important as also taking care of others. So like I wish sometimes I could offer like a perfect mathematical science to it. My experience is that it hasn't worked that way. It's been trying and taking it week at a time, month at a time.
Thank you. Thomas, can you go up and use the mic? Oh, thank you, Stephen. The other Thomas, both elders, actually.
Thank you, Reverend, for coming here. I wanted to ask a little about, you talked about that articulation phase, right? How sometimes people skip it or rush through it. And I was reflecting on that a little bit and thinking about how in our sort of performative society, that phase looks like you're doing nothing, right? And there's a lot of, some of the pressure to skip over that phase is because, you have all these people saying, you need to go do something, right? And there's not that recognition necessarily that, that learning actually is a form of action. So, is there anything you would suggest for us, individuals who are going through that phase, or us as a community, to help kind of make sure that people don't rush that?
Yeah. I would say that we are going to have some, the first thing as you were talking that came to my brain was steel in our spine. meaning that we have to resist some of the microwave pressures of doing things and appearing a certain way, which means we're going to get some critique. And I think we have to be really committed to what it is that we're trying to do, which means that we're going to sometimes get critique. And I think the question we got to ask ourselves is, am I trying to actually solve the problem, or am I trying to win fans, right? So there was a time when I was doing the police work. I started the police work. The first time I did the trained Oakland Police Department was 2 weeks after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. And so during the whole time when I was doing bridging with police officers was during the launch of the movement for Black Lives in this country. And so I was getting called by some people to say, like, well, you selling out. And the worst thing you can call us in the black community is an Uncle Tom, right? And so people are like, you Tomming, you cooning, what's going on? And I had to know what it is that I was doing while actively having to manage the critique of people from my own community that felt like somehow my actions were betraying what was happening. But it's interesting when you'll stay on that journey, because then when the journey started changing, and then there was a need to figure out how do we actually do the structural change in the police department, and folks were like, well, we need somebody to figure out who knows how to do that. And they're like, oh, Ben can help. These are the same people who 18 months before were like, well, you cooning and tomming, right? So I think a part of what we've got to hold is we've got to know what we're doing. We got to sometimes show up. That requires us to show up at multiple places to hold relational equity, recognizing we're not always going to be treated the way we want to. I was on the front lines of the protests in Oakland, and I would go inside Oakland Police Department and train the police with the same collar on. And neither group really liked me too much, right? So I just think we have, and I hope that doesn't sound like I'm setting up myself like I'm some hero or something. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is we got to have real commitment to what it is we're trying to do. And if the articulation space takes long, and it does, give yourself that, and just know critique is going to come. That's a part of it, but it shouldn't deter us from moving forward.
I think that highlights something too, though, that this can be really lonely work, right? Because if you're not sort of trusted, or folks are feeling some kind of way about you, then you're really kind of, it can feel a little bit like you're on your own if you don't have community and champions to do that. You talk a little bit actually about also there's a point when you really lose the favor, I'll say, of the police, and someone makes a comment. I think it's a black police officer who said, "It's because you're bringing together the radicals and the moderates."
Right.
Like somehow that was an increase of threat, right? Like, can you talk about why that would be considered like more threatening?
Yeah, that was a scary time too, and I talk about it in the book and stuff, because there's nothing like I can't imagine what Dr. King went through, because I just went through my little splash of it for a couple of years, but it's nothing like having the police department whose taxes pay for them to actually start intimidating you and sitting outside your house and showing up at organizations that you're on the board for, saying they have meetings with you when they don't. And I mean, it was a terrifying experience. But when I asked him why this was happening, he told me, he said, well, when and I won't call some of the organizations' names who are my homies, but he was like, when they do their demonstrations, we don't really trip off them, because they're the like far left, and we feel like everybody knows like what they're going to do. If something happens, we know what they're going to do, and it's cool. And he said, you became a threat, because he was like, I was at the table. This was after we led the protest in 2016, after Alton Sterling, Philando Castile shut down 880 and ended up shutting down the Bay Bridge and all of that for 3 or 4 hours. So we shut down $4 million worth of commerce in the Bay Area for an evening. So people were pretty pissed off about it. And he's at the table, and he says they're banging on the table to the assistant chief at that time, saying, "Let us go get him. Give us the call. Let us go get him." And he said, I was like, "What is this, a Klan rally or something like that?" And they're like, "Oh, that's because you with that Black Lives Matter dude. That's the problem." But he told me, he said their concern was that we know what the far left is going to do. And he said, normally we would see you with them, but it's like, that's cool. He said, but when you showed up, you invited other faith leaders. Multiracial people showed up with you, white people, Asian people, Latino people, and you got them to show up at the same place that the radicals show up. And they said, we were really concerned about that because they said, if you can bridge those groups of people, we don't know how to deal with that threat. You know, which actually showed me the power of bridging. That if the police say that bringing together these groups is something that would force us to have to respond differently because we have a playbook for the way things are happening, you know, there's some power there. But what I found in doing that is we also don't have the infrastructure right now, which we need to build on how we hold people that fall on the far left of the spectrum, the people that might be a little bit more center left. I started wading into some water stalls to do some bridging with some folks that are center right. I'll hang in the far right. I can't do that. God bless. God bless.
Not everyone can bridge with everyone, right?
Yeah,
That's what
can't
you
bridge
said,
with everyone. You know, my great uncle was killed by the Klan, and so I can't do that. You know, but I know its power in the bridging work. And you know, another just quick thing I would say, another quick case study is Desmond Meade and Neil Volz in Florida. Neil is a white Trump-supporting evangelical. Desmond's formerly incarcerated brother that got his law degree, organizer in Florida. They came together in 2013, 2014 to restore the right to vote for 1.4 million Floridians. And because they bridged in 2016, when Trump got elected, DeSantis won the governorship, but they passed the right to vote for 1.4 million Floridians at 60-something% because they were willing to bridge across difference and move into different communities. And so I really believe that bridging can actually be a power-building strategy to change the structural conditions of our world rather than it just being seen as a feel-good strategy to lessen our anxiety.
Thank you. I think we've got time for maybe one or two more questions. Phil?
Hi. This may be a rhetorical question, but you know, in general, I think people conceptually agree on compromise or collaboration, as long as you're on their side when you go into the, and then there's the politics of you know, having to give concessions. So do you ever find yourself, you know, pretending to side with one side just to get them to the table, and then having to do the same for the other side to get them to the table, and then losing trust as a result of having to do that work?
That's a really good question. That's not rhetorical at all.
Like, I've got some real examples.
Here's the quick answer I would say is, in the past, I did do that at times to try to make things happen. But to your point, it created shallow waters that didn't enable us to really get to the deep answer that we needed. So where my approach changed was to stop pretending and actually be honest about difference. We see it different. And the call for belonging is about how do we create a wider circle in relationship to the perceived other. So what I'm trying to do is not pretend so that we can get all of our stuff done in a smaller circle, but actually to figure out how do we get a bigger circle so that you get what it is that you need and I get what it is that I need. So when I talk about us all being in a circle, it doesn't mean us all being proximate to each other. Like, there's some people who the way that they want to be human in this country, I don't want to be proximate to them. But I don't want the circle to be small where it does not include them, because the smallness of it is going to force violence. Because if there's only space for a certain amount of pie, then we're going to be violent on who gets the pie. I mean, look at what's happening right now, you know, in Palestine, Israel, right? So to me, the deeper question is, we've got to do the work to figure out how do we expand the conversation. To boil it down to a practical example, how do the police get what they need when I was in that work? And how did we as the community who needed safety and security get what it is that we needed? We had to change the way we thought about safety collectively. But that took years of, we had to understand policing. They had to understand what it meant to be policed for 400 years from the evolution of slave patrols. When I did that training for police, they didn't know that, right? So a lot of it is figuring out how to go slow and get a wider circle, but then we need the infrastructure to maintain it, which cities aren't funding, along with others are trying to call them to fund it, but I do think there's a very strategic role for churches in service to this, because my belief is that institutions are what maintain our culture, not individuals. And so I'm always thinking about what are the role of institutions, churches, companies, organizations, city. Institutions have to maintain that culture, but we need leaders to be honest within those institutions about the role that they'll be willing to play. Recognizing that sometimes when an institutional leader takes a big step forward, people kick them out.
They're the target.
Yeah.
Yeah. They become the target.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, it requires a real, like a built of institutional trust too, because no one wants to be part of an organization that everyone thinks is untrustworthy. So you have to have kind of a bigger vision for what's possible. I appreciate that. I want to be mindful of our time. Go ahead, Joshua. One last question.
Thanks so much for being with us, Ben. Appreciate it. So there seems to be a tension in my mind with churches needing to publicly acknowledge and practice truth-telling, and this tension with what you've described as something really beautiful, like practicing integrity and making sure change is happening within our community. And so not practicing this performative, not practicing this pretending. Can you talk a little bit about how those things aren't in tension? Because I feel like for us, they seem like they could be, like this truth-telling, and at the same time, trying not to pretend or just perpetuate what's performative activism.
Yeah. Just to say my little buzz line again, I do think, wrong first question is what do we need to do? Right first question is who do we need to become? Doesn't mean that what do we need to do isn't a question we need to have, right? So sometimes I'm saying people are like, all you want us to do is become. I'm like, no, I want you to get up and do something. But the reason we need to do the becoming is the becoming helps us know what to do. And so I think institutions need to commit themselves to becoming people that can show up to the conversation better. Rather than having a few stars jump out and be loud and proud, and then it just dissipates. As somebody that led a lot of protests here in this city, here in this area, there's a lot of people that's like, faith leaders like, we with you, Ben, we show up, let's do it. And then it's like, I have my cathartic release, and then I get to go back to my comfort.
Business as usual.
Yeah, business as usual. Like, we did that. Everybody's taking the protest pic. It's getting on Instagram now. Who cares? I'm not trying to be harmful, but I'm just keeping it a buck, right? That's not the point. The point is, how do we need to do our work inside? What does it mean for us to struggle to become a community that can really hold how the circle needs to be widened where we are? Right? I'm a firm believer that charity begins at home and then it's spread abroad. Love begins at home. This is in the scripture, right? So what does it mean for us to do that here? This doesn't mean that I'm not aware of other ways that othering is happening around, but I'm not called to be reactive to everything that's happening. I'm called to be faithful to what's happening where I am. So I didn't ask anybody to think about the kill zone in terms of, they would hear my story and like, well, I'm moving to the kill zone. Like, we don't need you to come to the kill zone. We need you to relate to whatever zone you're in a deep way of faithfulness. And it's something one of the loved ones that Ferguson told me when I was there. His name's Tef Poe. Great person to follow. He's got some wild Instagram stuff, but Tef is a little social prophet. In any case, Tef, when I was in Ferguson, and I was like, man, you the bomb, dude. Like, man, thank you for what you're doing, blah, blah, blah. I was just so grateful to be around these young people because they had so much courage that I didn't have at 37, 38 years old. And Tef looked at me. He was like, I'm glad you're here in Ferguson, but let me ask you this. He said, are you in the streets at home in Oakland, and have you found me at home in your neighborhood where your church is? Because there's a me there. So I appreciate you celebrating me, but I want you to be as active with the me where you're at than coming to Ferguson and just celebrating us and taking pictures. And so what that's continued to push me to go is, I just left San Antonio. Their story is not about, racial, it's all about race in this country as far as I'm concerned, but their story isn't necessarily about police violence or whatever. It's about economic segregation. It's about the fact that 9 out of 10 Latino relatives find themselves living without enough food, shelter, clothing, medicine, and education to be able to thrive. So faithfulness for them is about how do they respond to that conversation, but that's going to be different from what's happening in San Francisco and where City Church is rooted in San Francisco. So I really invite us to we can care in prayer and in concern about everything that's happening around the world, because we know the world is big, but it's small. But I think we should be faithful to where it is that we are. It will mean sometimes we'll get punches, we'll get told from folks that, you're not doing enough. I think we just got to learn to take that and lean into our champions and communities, be faithful to where we're at, and let God do the rest. Because at the end of the day, what I had to embrace to deal with this thing mentally, because it almost drove me crazy, what I had to deal with to hold is that God is saving the world.
That's right.
Not me. And I had to let myself off the hook. I'm not Batman, and neither are you.
But we all maybe wish we were a little bit like Bruce Wayne,
I know,
right?
we do.
Well, thank you. A good, gracious, challenging, invitational word to our community. And as we close out our time, would it be okay if we prayed for you?
That would be wonderful.
Okay, let's
Yeah.
pray. God, we thank you for your beloved child, Ben. We thank you that you stirred up within him a vision that was beyond himself, that you surrounded him with good people, family that were willing to support him and join him in that work. We ask, God, that as he continues to live into the call that you have placed on his life, to bring about a world where everyone can flourish through this vision of a broadened, wider circle of concern, of human concern, that you would strengthen him, that you would surround him with community and champions that can encourage him and also hold him accountable to that call as well. I pray, God, that you would continue to help him to be encouraged, but also see where there is still work yet to be done. We pray for this community here at City Church, and we ask, God, that you would help us to lean into this work of becoming in a deep and true way so that we might truly live into our call and our desire to be good news for the city of San Francisco, however that leads us as a community. We thank you for this time. And as we leave, we ask that we would leave with cups full, with hearts filled to overflowing at what it is that you are doing among us even today. And may we also be troubled in our spirits to keep doing the work that you invite us into so that we might continue to grow and bear witness to your good vision of wholeness of life for all. We pray this with gratitude and in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.